The little girl wasn't crying when Bear found her at the abandoned bus stop. That was what scared him most. She just sat in the rain, bruised, silent, and clutching a torn blue backpack like her life depended on it. When Bear asked, "Who did this to you?" she whispered, "My step-uncle." Then she opened the backpack, and inside was proof that her mother's death was never an accident. The rain came down hard over Red Creek, Montana, turning the empty road silver and the old bus stop into a gray blur beside the highway. Marcus Bear Callahan was driving back from a parts run when his headlights caught something small sitting under the cracked shelter. Bear was 54, a former Marine with broad shoulders, a weathered face, and a quiet way of moving that made people step aside before he ever spoke. Most folks in Red Creek knew him as the owner of Callahan Auto, the man with scarred hands, a deep voice, and eyes that had seen too many things to be easily surprised. But that afternoon, he was surprised. A little girl sat on the wet concrete bench, soaked from head to toe. She looked about 8 years old, with dark blonde hair plastered to her cheeks and a torn blue backpack locked in both arms. Her face was turned down, but when lightning flashed behind the hills, Bear saw the bruising along her cheek, the split at her lip, and the swelling beneath one eye. He stopped the truck so fast, the tires hissed against the wet road. Bear stepped out into the rain and walked toward her slowly. He did not rush. He had learned a long time ago that frightened children watched every movement. One wrong step, one loud word, and they disappeared inside themselves. "Hey, sweetheart," he said, keeping his voice low. "Are you hurt?" The girl lifted her eyes. Her name was Emily Parker. She was small for her age, pale from the cold, and sitting so still she almost looked like part of the broken bus stop. But her hands were alive, gripping that backpack tighter the closer Bear came. He crouched several feet away, giving her space. "Who did this to you?" Bear asked. Emily's lips trembled. She looked past him toward the road, as if checking whether someone had followed her. Then she pulled the blue backpack tighter against her chest and whispered, "It was my step-uncle." Bear's expression changed for only a second. His jaw hardened, but his voice stayed gentle. "What's his name?" Emily swallowed. "Raymond Cole." The name landed wrong. Even before Bear knew why, he felt it, the kind of silence that comes before trouble. He took off his jacket and placed it around Emily's shoulders. When he reached to adjust it, her body stiffened, and the backpack pressed even harder against her ribs. "I won't touch the bag," Bear said. Emily looked at him then, really looked, and gave one tiny nod. That was when Bear noticed the bracelet on her wrist, a thin silver chain with a tiny blue star charm. His breath caught. His daughter, Sarah, had worn one almost exactly like it when she was little, before the accident that had split Bear's life into before and after. For a moment, the rain, the road, and the mountains all disappeared. Then Emily shivered, and Bear came back to himself. "There's a diner across the road," he said. "Warm lights, hot food, people inside. You can hold your bag the whole time. I just want to get you out of the rain." Emily hesitated, then nodded. Bear helped her stand without touching her more than necessary. Together they crossed to Martha's Diner, a small place with fogged windows and a red neon sign buzzing weakly above the door. Martha Green, the owner, was a heavy-set woman in her late 60s with sharp gray eyes, flour on her apron, and the tired kindness of someone who had fed half the town for 30 years. She looked up when Bear came in with Emily. Then she saw the child's face. "Oh, Lord," Martha whispered. "Call the sheriff," Bear said, "and get her something warm." Martha moved quickly, but when Bear said Raymond Cole's name, the diner changed, The cook stopped scraping the grill. Two men at the counter lowered their eyes. Martha's hand froze over the phone. Bear saw it all. Emily sat in a corner booth, still clutching the blue backpack, still refusing to let it leave her lap. Martha brought hot chocolate and a blanket, but her face had gone pale. Bear leaned close to Martha and asked, "What do you know?" Martha glanced toward Emily, then toward the rain-streaked window. "Raymond Cole," she whispered, "is a man people in this town don't touch." Bear looked back at Emily, at the bruises, at the backpack, at the bracelet on her wrist. Then he sat down across from the girl and waited with her. Because whatever Red Creek was afraid of, Bear Callahan had just decided he was not walking away. Deputy Noah Brooks arrived at Martha's diner 23 minutes after Martha called the sheriff's office. He was young, maybe 27, with sandy hair damp from the rain and a uniform that still looked too new for the weight of the badge on his chest. His eyes went straight to Emily Parker in the corner booth. She sat wrapped in Martha's blanket, both hands locked around the torn blue backpack in her lap. Noah's face tightened when he saw her bruised cheek and split lip, but he quickly looked away, as if the sight had cut too close to something he was not ready to face. Bear stood beside the booth, arms crossed, watching every move. Noah cleared his throat and said, "Protocol says I need to take her back to her legal guardian until we can file a report." The moment Emily heard the words, "take her back," her whole body went rigid. Her fingers dug into the backpack so hard, her knuckles turned white. Bear saw it. Martha saw it. Even Noah saw it, and for 1 second, shame flickered across the deputy's face. Bear stepped forward, his voice low but firm. "You are not putting that child back in the same house she ran from." Before Noah could answer, the diner door opened again. Sheriff Calvin Ross walked in like a man who expected every room to obey him. He was in his late 50s, tall and broad, with silver hair combed neatly back and a polished badge pinned to a clean brown uniform. His smile looked friendly until it reached his eyes, where it turned cold. He glanced at Emily, then at Bear, and said, "This is a family matter, Callahan. Raymond Cole is her step-uncle. He has a right to know where she is." Emily lowered her head. Bear did not move. "A man loses that right when a child is bleeding in the rain because of him," Bear said. Ross's smile vanished. "You need to stay out of this." The diner went silent again, that same frightened silence Bear had noticed when Raymond's name was first spoken. Noah stood beside his sheriff, but he would not look at Emily. Bear watched him carefully and saw the conflict there. A good man trapped under a bad man's command. Ross ordered Noah to write the report and told Martha not to spread rumors. Then he turned back to Bear and said, "Red Creek takes care of its own." Bear looked around the diner, at the lowered eyes and tight mouths, and understood exactly what that meant. In this town, taking care of its own meant protecting Raymond Cole. That was when the bell above the diner door rang softly, and Grace Whitaker stepped inside. Grace was a thin woman in her early 70s, with white hair pinned at the back of her head, a wool coat buttoned to her throat, and the steady eyes of someone who had survived disappointment without becoming cruel. Martha had called her quietly from the kitchen. Grace had once taught English at Red Creek Elementary, and years ago she had taught Emily's mother, Laura Parker. When Grace saw Emily, her face broke for half a second before she controlled it. She approached the booth slowly and whispered, "Oh, Laura's girl." Grace spoke to the sheriff with surprising calm. She said Emily could stay with her for the night because she was a known family friend and a retired school teacher. Ross hated the idea, but Noah suddenly found his voice. "It's acceptable temporary placement, Sheriff. Until Child Services is contacted." Ross stared at him long enough to make Noah swallow. But with Martha watching and Bear standing there like a wall, he finally agreed. Outside, as Bear helped Grace walk Emily to her car, Grace leaned close and whispered, "Laura tried to leave Raymond before she died. She came to me once with a suitcase in her trunk." Bear looked at her sharply, but Grace only shook her head. "Not here. Not yet." Emily climbed into Grace's old station wagon, still holding the blue backpack. Bear watched the car pull away, then turned toward his truck. Across the wet street, half hidden beneath the flickering bus stop light, a black pickup sat with its engine running. Its windows were tinted dark, but Bear felt eyes behind the glass. When he took one step toward it, the truck rolled away slowly, then disappeared down the road. Bear stood in the rain, jaw set. Raymond Cole was not just a violent man. He was a protected man, and protected men always believed the whole town belonged to them. Grace Whitaker's house sat at the edge of Red Creek, where the last streetlights gave up and the pine woods began. It was a narrow, white farmhouse with yellow curtains, books stacked on every table, and the warm smell of cinnamon tea in the air. Emily Parker sat on Grace's sofa with a quilt around her shoulders, still clutching the torn blue backpack like someone might reach through the walls and take it. Bear Callahan stood near the window, watching the road outside. The black pickup had not returned, but he did not trust empty streets anymore. Grace placed a mug of warm milk on the coffee table. Emily stared at it, but did not touch it. Then, slowly, she looked at Bear and Grace. "My mom told me not to open it unless I had to," she said. Her voice was small, but the room seemed to lean toward it. "She said if something happened to her, I had to keep this safe." Grace's face went pale at the mention of Laura. Bear lowered himself into the chair across from Emily, careful not to crowd her. "You don't have to show us unless you want to," he said. Emily looked down at the backpack. "I think I have to now." With trembling fingers, Emily unzipped the main pocket. Inside was a small notebook with a cracked leather cover, several old photographs wrapped in a plastic grocery bag, and a folded child's drawing tucked between them. In one picture, Laura Parker smiled beside Emily at a county fair, her arm wrapped tightly around her daughter. Laura was a pretty woman in her early 30s, with tired eyes that still tried to look hopeful. Grace touched the photograph with 2 fingers and whispered, "She looked just like that when she was in my class, always pretending she was fine." Emily opened the notebook. On the first page was a drawing she had made of her mother standing in a bedroom doorway, one hand raised like she was telling someone to stop. The lines were simple, but the fear in the picture was clear. "I used to draw when they fought," Emily said. "Mom said drawing made the noise smaller." Bear's jaw tightened. Grace covered her mouth and turned away for a moment. Then Emily lifted the torn lining at the bottom of the backpack and pulled out a small black USB drive taped beneath the fabric. "She sewed it in here," Emily said. "She said bad people only look in pockets." Bear called Eli Turner. Eli was one of the few men Bear trusted without asking twice. He was 48, lean, quiet, and sharp-eyed, with close-cropped black hair, a permanent limp from Afghanistan, and the mind that could take apart electronics faster than most men could open a toolbox. He arrived 30 minutes later in an old gray Jeep with a laptop bag and no questions until he saw Emily's face. Then he asked only one. "Is she safe right now?" Bear answered, "For the moment." Eli nodded and got to work at Grace's kitchen table. The USB was damaged, but not dead. Eli copied the files before opening anything. There were scanned insurance papers, land deeds for the Parker property, and audio recordings labeled only by dates. In the first recording, Laura's voice shook as she said Raymond wanted her to sign over the land before the insurance settlement cleared. In another, Raymond's voice came through low and ugly. You think anybody in this town is going to believe you over me?" Emily stared at the floor while it played. Grace reached for her hand, and this time, Emily let her take it. Then Eli stopped scrolling. His eyes narrowed at the screen. "There's one encrypted file," he said. "Name is Ross." Bear looked toward the dark window. Sheriff Calvin Ross's cold smile from the diner returned in his mind. Grace sank into a chair as if her legs had suddenly weakened. "Laura came to me once," she admitted. "She said Raymond had friends in places that mattered. I told her to go to the sheriff. She looked at me like I had just told her to walk into a fire." Grace's voice broke. "I should have done more." Bear did not soften the truth, but he did not punish her with it either. "Then do more now," he said. Grace wiped her eyes, sat up straighter, and placed Laura's photograph beside the notebook. "I will," she said. "I was afraid when Laura needed me. I won't be afraid for her daughter." Emily looked at the three adults around the table, then rested her hand on the backpack at her side. For the first time since the bus stop, she was not holding it like a shield. She was holding it like proof. Bear, Eli, and Grace spent the next hour at Grace's kitchen table, surrounded by Laura Parker's notebook, the old photographs, and the files Eli had recovered from the USB. Outside, the rain had softened into a cold mist, tapping against the windows like fingers. Eli enlarged one scanned document after another, comparing dates, signatures, and insurance records. Grace sat stiffly beside him, one hand resting on Laura's photograph. Bear stood behind them, silent, his arms folded, watching every detail as if the truth might try to slip away if he blinked. The official story had always been simple. Laura Parker died 18 months earlier when her car went off Black Pine Road, a narrow mountain pass outside Red Creek. The report called it a loss of control on wet pavement. No witnesses, no criminal suspicion. But then Eli opened one of the audio files from the USB. Laura's voice filled the kitchen, thin and frightened. "If something happens to me, it wasn't the road," she whispered in the recording. "Raymond was in the garage last night. I saw him near my brake line. I'm scared I won't make it through the week." Grace began to cry quietly, but Emily, asleep upstairs, did not hear it. Bear turned away from the table for a moment, because Laura's voice had reached a place in him he usually kept locked. Years earlier, his daughter Sarah had nearly died in a crash caused by a man she had trusted. A man Bear had warned her about too late. Sarah survived, but the accident broke their family in ways Bear never learned how to repair. He had blamed himself for not seeing enough, not acting fast enough, not staying close enough. Now, listening to Laura speak from beyond the grave, he felt that old failure rise again, sharp and familiar. A soft knock came at the back door. Bear opened it to find Deputy Noah Brooks standing in the mist, soaked through his uniform jacket, his face pale with fear and decision. Noah was no longer the uncertain young deputy from Martha's diner. He looked like a man who had crossed a line and knew he could not uncross it. Without stepping inside, he handed Bear a brown envelope. "This is a copy of Laura Parker's accident report," Noah said quietly. The original had notes about brake failure. They disappeared before the final filing. Bear brought the envelope to the table. Eli scanned the pages quickly, his expression hardening with every line. There were inconsistencies everywhere. Changed timestamps, missing photographs, a mechanic's note removed from the final version, and a witness statement marked irrelevant. At the bottom of the final report was the approval signature of Sheriff Calvin Ross. Noah swallowed and finally said what he had been holding back. "I suspected something was wrong back then, but Ross told me to stop asking questions. I was new, I was scared. I told myself I needed the job." He looked at Grace. "I'm sorry." Grace did not answer right away. Her phone buzzed on the table. She glanced down, and the blood drained from her face. Bear picked it up before she could hide it. The message came from an unknown number. Old woman, don't dig up what's buried. No name, no signature, but everyone in the room knew who had sent it. Noah looked at the phone, then at the report, then at Bear. Something changed in him completely. I'll testify to what I saw, he said. Whatever Ross does to me. Bear folded the report carefully and placed it beside Laura's photograph. Good, he said. Because Laura's death was not an accident anymore. It's evidence. By morning, Raymond Cole had moved faster than anyone expected. He filed an emergency guardianship petition at the Red Creek Courthouse, claiming Emily Parker had been unlawfully taken from him by Grace Whitaker and Marcus Bear Callahan. The words on the document were clean and official, but the lie underneath them was ugly. Raymond described himself as Emily's only stable family connection. He described Grace as an elderly woman acting out of grief, and he described Bear as a violent, former Marine with a history of intimidation. Attached to the petition was a statement from Sheriff Calvin Ross, warning the court that Bear was an unstable outside influence with military trauma and a known capacity for violence. The first hearing was scheduled before lunch. Grace dressed Emily in a clean blue sweater and brushed her hair with trembling hands. Emily barely spoke. She held the torn backpack in her lap during the drive, even though Grace promised it would stay with her. Bear followed behind them in his truck, keeping enough distance not to look threatening, but close enough for Emily to see him in the rear window. He knew what Ross was doing. They were not just trying to take Emily back. They were trying to make Bear look like the danger, so Raymond could look like family. The courthouse smelled of floor polish, old paper, and fear. Raymond was already there, standing beside Sheriff Ross near the front of the room. Raymond Cole was in his early 40s, handsome in a carefully practiced way, with a dark suit, clean-shaven face, and eyes that turned soft whenever someone important looked at him. When Emily saw him, her hand flew to Grace's. Her fingers squeezed so hard Grace winced, but she did not pull away. Raymond looked at the child and smiled like a wounded uncle. Emily lowered her eyes. Bear, seated 2 rows behind them, said nothing. He was not allowed to speak, but his stillness gave Emily something steady to look toward. At first, everything went exactly the way Raymond wanted. His attorney argued that Emily had been influenced by strangers, that Grace was confused, and that Bear had inserted himself into a private family matter. Sheriff Ross repeated his concern about Bear's aggressive presence at Martha's diner. The judge, Harold Keene, listened with a tired face and asked very few questions. He was a narrow man in his 60s, with gray eyebrows and the careful expression of someone who already knew which way the room wanted him to lean. Grace tried to explain, but Raymond's attorney kept interrupting her. Then the back door opened. Claire Donovan walked in carrying a leather briefcase and moving like she had no intention of asking permission to belong there. Claire was Grace's niece, a 32-year-old family law attorney from Missoula, with sharp brown eyes, a navy suit, and the kind of calm voice that made people stop talking just to hear what she would say next. She placed herself beside Grace and said, "Your Honor, I represent the interests of Emily Parker. I am requesting an immediate pause before any placement decision is made." Claire laid out just enough to change the temperature of the room. She said there was newly recovered evidence concerning Laura Parker's death, documented signs of ongoing abuse, and a credible concern that returning Emily to Raymond Cole would place her in immediate danger. She did not reveal everything. She was too smart for that. But she named the USB, the altered accident report, and Deputy Noah Brooks as a potential witness. Judge Keene's pen stopped moving. Sheriff Ross's jaw tightened. Raymond's smile disappeared for half a second, and Claire saw it. The judge did not grant Raymond custody that day, but he also did not end the fight. He ordered Emily to remain temporarily with Grace until a follow-up hearing, and demanded stronger evidence before making a permanent ruling. Outside the courtroom, Claire pulled Bear aside. "Keene is being pressured," she said quietly. "Ross has weight in this county, and Raymond knows how to look harmless in a suit. What we have is enough to slow them down, not enough to bury them." Bear looked through the glass doors at Emily, still holding Grace's hand. Claire followed his gaze. "We need a witness who saw the pattern before this week. Someone local. Someone the court can't dismiss." Claire Donovan did not waste time after the hearing. In Grace Whitaker's kitchen, she spread her notes across the table and said the case had one weakness: pattern. The USB, the altered accident report, and Laura's recordings were powerful, but the court still needed someone who had seen Emily's suffering over time. Emily sat quietly beside Grace, drawing small circles on the edge of a napkin. When Claire asked if anyone near the old Parker house had ever noticed anything, Emily whispered, "Mrs. Carter used to leave muffins on the porch." Bear looked up. "Did she ever ask about the bruises?" Emily nodded once. "I told her I fell." Mrs. Helen Carter lived in a yellow house across from the Parker property, with wind chimes on the porch and curtains pulled tight in every window. She was in her late 60s, thin and nervous, with silver hair cut short and hands that shook when she opened the door. The moment she saw Bear, she tried to close it. "I don't want trouble," she said. Bear kept both hands visible and spoke softly. "I'm not here to bring trouble to your house, ma'am. I'm here because Emily said you used to leave food for her." Helen froze. Bear added, "She remembers the muffins." The old woman's face broke. She leaned against the doorframe as if the sentence had taken the strength out of her. "She was always hungry," Helen whispered. "That poor baby would sit on the steps like she was waiting for someone to remember she existed." Bear did not push. He simply stood there in silence until Helen stepped aside and let him in. Her living room was spotless, but the air felt heavy with years of things unsaid. On the coffee table sat a Bible, a sewing basket, and a framed photograph of Helen's late husband in a volunteer firefighter uniform. Helen disappeared into the hallway and returned with a shoebox tied shut with string. She placed it in Bear's hands like it weighed more than wood and cardboard. Inside were printed photos, each dated on the back. Emily with a bruised arm in March. Emily with a swollen cheek in May. Emily standing alone by the mailbox in July, wearing long sleeves in summer heat. There was also a small memory card wrapped in tissue. "I recorded him once," Helen said. Raymond dragged her inside by the wrist while she was crying. "I told myself I was collecting proof. Truth is, I was scared." Bear brought the shoebox back to Grace's house, where Claire photographed everything and Eli copied the memory card onto 3 separate drives. Emily watched from the doorway while Helen arrived later, trembling but determined. When Helen saw her, she began to cry. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," she said. "I should have done more." Emily stared at her for a long moment, then said, "But you're doing it now." No one in the room spoke after that. It was a small sentence, but it changed the air. For the first time, Emily seemed to understand that some adults failed, but some could still choose to become brave. That night, Raymond found out. No one knew who told him, but just after midnight, Eli's security camera caught headlights near Helen Carter's property. Bear and Eli reached the house minutes later and found smoke rising from the backyard shed. Raymond was gone, but the message was clear. Destroy the evidence, frighten the witness, remind the town why it had stayed quiet. The shed door was charred, but the shoebox was not there anymore. Eli had already copied every file, every photo, every date. Helen stood on her porch in her robe, shaking, but she did not run inside. "I'll still testify," she said. Bear looked at the blackened shed, then back at her. Then he just made the wrong woman angry. The final hearing was moved to the county courthouse in Missoula after Claire filed a motion questioning Red Creek's local influence. The courtroom was larger, brighter, and harder for Sheriff Calvin Ross to control. Emily Parker did not have to sit in front of Raymond Cole. Claire had arranged for her statement to be presented through Dr. Miriam Hayes, a child protection specialist in her 40s with a calm voice, silver glasses, and the patient manner of someone trained to listen without causing more harm. Emily stayed in a side room with Grace, where she could hold the blue backpack and watch Bear through the glass whenever she needed to remember she was not alone. Bear sat in the back row, silent and still. He wore a clean black jacket instead of his work clothes, but he looked no less like a wall. Every time Emily glanced toward the courtroom from the side room, Bear was there. He did not wave. He did not smile too much. He simply gave one small nod each time, the same message every time. "I am here." Grace sat beside Emily, one hand over the child's fingers, and for once, the old teacher did not look ashamed. She looked ready. Claire Donovan began with the USB. She played Laura Parker's recordings just long enough for the court to hear the fear in Laura's voice and the threat in Raymond's. Then she entered the recovered insurance documents, the land deed papers, and the encrypted file labeled Ross, which Eli Turner had finally opened. Eli, the former military technician, testified that the file contained scanned correspondence between Raymond and Sheriff Ross about the Parker land, including notes about a future sale to a private development company. The land had been worth far more than Laura had ever been told. Then came Helen Carter's video. The courtroom went silent as the footage showed Raymond dragging Emily toward the Parker house while the child cried and tried to pull away. Helen, trembling but firm, testified about the dates, the bruises, and the years she had watched from across the street, too afraid to act until Emily's name forced her conscience open. Claire did not shame her. She simply let the facts stand. The judge listened. This time, no one interrupted. Deputy Noah Brooks took the stand next. His uniform looked heavy on him, but his voice did not shake. He testified that Laura's original accident report had included concerns about brake failure, missing photographs, and a mechanic's note that disappeared before the final filing. Then he turned toward Sheriff Ross and said, "Sheriff Ross ordered me to stop asking questions. He protected Raymond Cole because they were both involved in a land deal tied to the Parker property." Ross stood up immediately, shouting that Noah was lying, but the judge ordered him to sit down. Raymond's attorney tried to recover the room, but Raymond destroyed himself first. His face had gone red, his calm mask cracked completely. And when Claire asked why he believed Emily should be returned to him, he slammed his hand on the table and shouted, "Because she belongs to me. Laura owed me everything, and that girl is part of what she left behind." The sentence hung in the room like smoke. Even his own attorney went still. Claire did not need to argue with it. She only looked at the judge and said, "Your Honor, I believe Mr. Cole has answered the question." By the end of the hearing, Sheriff Ross was suspended, pending investigation. Raymond Cole was taken into custody on charges connected to child abuse, witness intimidation, evidence tampering, and renewed inquiry into Laura Parker's death. Grace held Emily as the deputies led Raymond away, and for the first time since Laura died, Grace let herself breathe without blaming herself for every silence in the past. She had failed Laura once, but she had stood up for Laura's daughter, and in that courtroom, that mattered. Grace Whitaker was granted temporary guardianship of Emily Parker 3 days after the Missoula hearing, and permanent guardianship 6 weeks later. Claire Donovan stood beside them in court when the order was signed, her briefcase at her feet and tears she refused to acknowledge shining in her eyes. Emily wore a yellow dress Grace had bought her, and the torn blue backpack sat in her lap, no longer clutched like a lifeline, but held like a memory. When the judge asked if she understood where she would be living, Emily nodded and said, "With Grace. At home." Raymond Cole did not smile in public anymore. He sat behind glass in county jail while prosecutors reopened Laura Parker's death as a criminal investigation. New charges followed: child abuse, witness intimidation, evidence tampering, fraud, and conspiracy related to the Parker land deal. Sheriff Calvin Ross lost his badge before the federal investigators finished their first week in Red Creek. By the end of the month, his name was no longer on the sheriff's office door. The people who had once lowered their eyes now stopped on the sidewalk to talk. Some apologized. Some gave statements. Some finally admitted what they had seen. Deputy Noah Brooks was appointed acting sheriff until a special election could be held. He was still young, still nervous in front of crowds, but when he stood on the courthouse steps and promised that Red Creek would never again call abuse a family matter, no one laughed. Martha Green started a donation jar at Martha's Diner, then turned it into something larger: a weekly supper fundraiser for children and families escaping violent homes. The first Friday night, every table was full. Helen Carter brought muffins. Eli Turner installed security cameras for free at Grace's house, Martha's Diner, and Helen's porch. Emily went back to school on a Monday morning, with Grace holding one hand and Bear standing by his truck across the street. Mrs. Flores, Emily's second-grade teacher, was a warm woman with curly black hair, bright scarves, and the kind of voice that made children feel safe before they knew why. She welcomed Emily without making the whole class stare. Later that week, Emily read a story aloud for the first time since her mother died. Her voice shook at the beginning, but by the last page, she was reading clearly. Grace cried in the hallway, where Emily could not see. Bear returned to Callahan Auto and tried to convince himself his part was finished, but Red Creek had changed him too. One afternoon, a woman came in with 2 children in the back seat and a car that would not start. She had no money and a bruise she tried to hide with makeup. Bear fixed the car before sunset and handed her the keys without a bill. By the end of the week, a sign hung in the garage window: free emergency repairs for mothers and children leaving unsafe homes. No questions asked. Eli helped. Noah referred people quietly. Martha sent food. Grace sent blankets. A few weeks later, Bear found an envelope waiting at the garage. Inside was a drawing in colored pencil. It showed a large man standing in the rain, holding an umbrella over a little girl with a blue backpack. The man was drawn too big, the umbrella too small, and the rain came down in crooked lines. But beneath it, in careful second-grade letters, Emily had written, "You stayed." Bear stared at it for a long time, then pinned it above his workbench where every customer could see it. That evening, Bear sat alone in the garage after closing and took out his phone. His daughter's name, Sarah, waited on the screen like a door he had been too afraid to knock on. This time, he pressed call. When she answered, her voice was cautious, older than the memory he carried. Bear closed his eyes and said, "I know I disappeared when things got hard. I won't ask you to forgive me tonight. I just want to tell you something." He looked at Emily's drawing on the wall. "This time, I'm not disappearing again." Looking back now, Bear understood one thing clearly. Sometimes God does not send help with wings or halos. Sometimes he sends a tired man driving through the rain, a teacher who finally finds her courage, a neighbor who stops being silent, and a child brave enough to tell the truth. Emily was not saved by one miracle. She was saved because ordinary people finally chose to do what was right. So let me ask you, if you were in Bear's place, would you have stopped in that rain? Would you have risked your peace for a child who had no one else? Or would you have looked away, like everyone else in Red Creek once did? Tell me in the comments, do you believe God put certain people in our path for a reason? And if this story touched your heart, please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more powerful, emotional, and unforgettable stories.